Linda almost threw the old coffee tin in the trash. It had sat in her mother's closet for decades, dented and rusted, the kind of thing you toss without a second thought. But inside wasn't loose change, it was a ledger. Pages of handwriting from 1974, tracking every single dollar that moved through a household during one of the harshest economies America had ever seen. No credit cards, no apps, just cash, envelopes, and the kind of discipline most of us have never been taught. What Linda found written on the very last page is the reason we're making this video. 20 forgotten fiscal habits from the 1970s that quietly built real wealth while everyone else was falling behind. Stay with us, because the 20th one is the habit nobody talks about anymore. If this is your first time here, subscribe, like this video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Linda set the coffee tin on her kitchen table and lifted the lid slowly, as if it might still belong to someone else. Inside, folded neatly beneath the ledger, were 7 small envelopes, each one labeled in her mother's careful handwriting: groceries, utilities, church, gas, clothing, savings, emergency. There was no bank card tucked between them, no receipt from an app, nothing digital at all, just paper, worn soft at the corners from being opened and closed 1,000 times. Linda ran her thumb across the word savings and felt something tighten in her chest. She remembered her mother standing at this same counter every single Friday evening, sorting bills into these same little paper pockets while the radio played low in the background. As a girl, Linda had thought it was tedious, even a little sad, watching her mother count out cash instead of simply swiping a card the way Linda did now for everything from coffee to car repairs. But sitting here as an adult, staring at 7 envelopes that had somehow carried a family of 5 through the worst inflation the country had seen in a generation, Linda began to wonder if she had misunderstood the whole practice. The envelope system wasn't about scarcity, it was about limits. When the money in an envelope ran out, it ran out. There was no overdraft, no minimum payment, no invisible debt quietly accumulating in the background. Every dollar had a job, and every job had a boundary. Linda opened the ledger to the first page and found a single sentence written at the top in blue ink. If you can't see it, you can't control it. She sat back in her chair. Somewhere behind that sentence was an entire philosophy her mother had lived by, and Linda had never once asked her about it. The next page of the ledger revealed something Linda hadn't expected. Every single Sunday evening, without exception, there was a new entry in her mother's handwriting, dated and totaled, no matter how small the week's spending had been. Linda flipped through months of these entries, then years of them, and realized her mother had never missed a single Sunday in over a decade. This wasn't budgeting, this was a ritual. Back in the 1970s, households facing double-digit inflation couldn't afford to guess where their money had gone. So women across the country, many of them just like Linda's mother, sat down at their kitchen tables every Sunday night and reconciled every receipt, every coin, every dollar spent against what remained in each envelope. It sounds almost old-fashioned now, in an era of instant bank notifications and automatic categorization apps that claim to track spending for us. But Linda began to notice a pattern in the ledger that no app has ever shown her about her own finances. Her mother didn't just record numbers, she wrote small notes beside them. Chicken was cheaper than beef this week, made stew instead. Skipped the bakery, baked bread at home, saved almost $2. These weren't complaints, they were victories, tracked and celebrated in ink. Linda realized that her mother's Sunday ritual wasn't really about money at all. It was about awareness. It forced a weekly confrontation with reality that modern automation quietly removes from our lives. When an app tracks spending for you, you stop paying attention. When you write it by hand every single week, you cannot look away. Linda closed the ledger for a moment, thinking about her own bank app, which she hadn't actually opened in almost 3 weeks. Tucked behind the ledger, Linda found a folded grocery receipt from October 1974. The ink faded, but still legible. Rice, flour, dried beans, canned tomatoes, powdered milk. The quantities stopped her cold. 20 pounds of flour, 10 pounds of rice, a dozen cans of tomatoes in a single trip. This wasn't a woman shopping for the week. This was a woman preparing for war, and in a sense she was. The 1970s brought stagflation, a brutal combination of rising prices and stagnant wages that squeezed American households from every direction. Linda's mother, like millions of others, responded by transforming her pantry into something closer to a small fortress. She bought staples in bulk when prices dipped, then rationed them carefully through the months when prices climbed. It meant fewer trips to the store, which meant fewer chances to be tempted by impulse purchases or rising shelf prices. It meant meals could be built from what was already on hand, regardless of what groceries cost that particular week. Linda thought about her own kitchen, with its half-empty cabinets and its reliance on last-minute delivery orders whenever she didn't feel like cooking. She had never once bought flour by the 20-pound bag. She had never needed to, or so she had always assumed. But looking at this receipt, Linda began to understand that bulk buying in the 1970s wasn't a personality quirk, it was insurance, a hedge against a world where prices could jump overnight and wages simply couldn't keep pace. The pantry was the buffer between chaos and calm, and it lived quietly in the back of a closet, stocked and waiting, long before anyone needed it. Beneath the receipts, Linda found something stranger. A small tin of sewing needles, a spool of thread, and a folded pamphlet titled Mending for the Modern Household. She almost laughed. Nobody kept pamphlets like this anymore. If a sleeve tore or a zipper broke, the item simply went in the trash, replaced within days by something new and cheap from an online order. But her mother's generation had operated under a completely different rule. If it could be fixed, it was fixed. Torn shirts were patched. Broken toasters were opened up and repaired at the kitchen table. Worn-out shoes went to the cobbler instead of the garbage can. Linda remembered, faintly now, her mother sitting under a lamp in the evenings with a needle and thread, working on something that Linda, as a child, had assumed was simply a hobby. It wasn't a hobby. It was math. Replacing a shirt cost real money in an economy where wages weren't rising fast enough to match prices. Repairing it cost almost nothing but time. Multiply that decision across 100 small items in a household, year after year, and the savings became substantial, even if no single repair felt significant on its own. Linda thought about her own habits, the broken blender she had replaced last month instead of researching a fix, the jacket with a missing button she had donated rather than repaired. Convenience had quietly replaced considered in her life, the same way it had for most people her age. The pamphlet in her hand wasn't nostalgic clutter. It was a manual for extending the life of everything a family owned, written at a time when that skill wasn't optional. It was survival. Linda opened her mother's old cleaning cabinet, still standing untouched in the corner of the house, and found no name-brand bottles at all. Instead, there were mason jars filled with pale liquids, hand-labeled in the same blue ink from the ledger. Vinegar and water, baking soda paste, a jar simply marked window solution. At first glance, it looked almost primitive compared to the aisle of colorful, scented cleaning products Linda bought every month without a second thought. But as she read further into the ledger, she found the actual math behind these jars, carefully tallied beside the grocery entries. A single box of baking soda, bought for a few cents, replaced what would have been several specialty cleaning products. Vinegar, already a pantry staple for cooking, doubled as a glass cleaner, a deodorizer, and a fabric softener. Nothing in the cabinet had been purchased specifically for cleaning. Everything served two purposes at once. This was a defining feature of 1970s household economics that Linda hadn't fully appreciated until now. Multi-purpose ingredients weren't just cheaper individually, they reduced the total number of products a family needed to buy, store, and eventually run out of and repurchase. Linda thought about her own cabinet, stocked with a dozen different bottles, each formulated for one narrow task, each eventually thrown away half-used when a newer version came along. Her mother's approach wasn't about deprivation, it was about efficiency, wringing maximum use out of the smallest number of ingredients possible. Linda picked up the jar marked Window Solution and unscrewed the lid. The smell of vinegar hit her immediately, sharp and familiar, and for a moment she was 7 years old again, watching her mother wipe down the windows before Sunday dinner. Behind the house, mostly grown over now, Linda found the outline of what had once been a vegetable garden. The ledger confirmed it in an entry from May 1975. Tomato seeds, bean seeds, a small bag of soil amendment, all for less than $2 combined. What followed in the pages after that entry stunned her. Nearly every summer meal recorded in the ledger that year included something from the garden: tomatoes for sauce, beans canned for winter, herbs dried and stored in small jars. The garden hadn't just supplemented groceries, it had replaced entire categories of them for months at a time. Linda realized this was one of the most overlooked disciplines of the era. A backyard garden, even a modest one, could offset a significant portion of a family's produce costs during an inflationary period when vegetable prices at the store were climbing weekly. It required labor, certainly, evenings spent weeding and watering instead of relaxing, but that labor was an investment that paid dividends every single week the garden produced. Linda thought about the small patch of unused grass behind her own home, currently home to nothing but a rarely used patio set. She had never once considered growing her own food, not seriously, not as a financial strategy rather than a hobby for people with more free time than she had. But the numbers in the ledger told a different story. A garden wasn't a luxury for people with time to spare. It was a tool, deployed deliberately by women who understood that every dollar not spent at the grocery store was a dollar that could go somewhere else entirely, into an envelope marked savings. Deep in the ledger, tucked between July and August of 1975, Linda found an entire week dedicated almost entirely to canning. Jars of tomatoes, jars of green beans, jars of peaches purchased in bulk while in season and preserved for months ahead. The entries were meticulous, tracking not just cost but shelf life, as if her mother were building a small underground reserve against something she feared was coming. In many ways, she was. The 1970s taught an entire generation of American women that prices could rise faster than anyone expected, and that the food on a store shelf in December might cost significantly more than it had in July. Canning was the answer. By preserving produce at its cheapest and most abundant point in the season, a household could effectively lock in lower prices for months at a time, insulating the family budget from the volatility hitting grocery stores everywhere else. Linda tried to imagine the scene, her mother standing over a boiling pot in the middle of summer heat, sealing jar after jar by hand, sweat on her brow, while somewhere on a television across town, the news reported on inflation numbers nobody could quite believe. It wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't even particularly enjoyable if the ledger's occasional note of exhausting, worth it, was any indication. But it was strategic in a way that felt almost foreign to Linda, who had never preserved so much as a single jar of anything in her entire adult life. She had always assumed that skill belonged to a different era, unnecessary now that grocery stores stocked fresh produce year-round. But year-round availability, Linda now understood, had never meant year-round affordability. A single line in the ledger caught Linda's attention. Dryer used twice this month, line otherwise. She sat with that sentence for a moment, trying to imagine drying an entire family's laundry outside week after week, regardless of the weather. It seemed impossibly inconvenient by modern standards. But when Linda looked at the utility entries recorded just below that note, she understood immediately why her mother had made that choice. Electricity costs during the 1970s energy crisis had climbed sharply, and appliances that consumed large amounts of power, especially dryers, had become expensive luxuries rather than daily conveniences. Line drying wasn't about nostalgia or tradition. It was a direct response to a utility bill that had nearly doubled in the span of a few years. Linda flipped ahead and found the pattern repeated across nearly every summer month in the ledger. The clothesline wasn't used occasionally, it was used constantly, treated as the default method rather than the backup plan. Only in winter, when the weather made outdoor drying impossible, did the dryer reappear in the entries with any regularity. Linda thought about her own laundry room, where the dryer ran multiple times a week without a second thought, the cost buried invisibly inside a monthly electric bill she barely glanced at before paying online. She had never once considered how much of that bill was tied to a single appliance, or how much could be saved simply by using a method her mother had relied on out of necessity rather than choice. It wasn't about romanticizing hardship. It was about recognizing that some modern conveniences carried a quiet, recurring cost that most people, Linda included, had simply stopped noticing. Linda found a small note clipped to a page near the middle of the ledger, a torn corner of paper that read simply, "Car payment, 1, not 2." It took her a moment to understand the significance. Her parents had raised 3 children on a single vehicle, something that felt almost unthinkable in Linda's own life, where she and her husband each drove separately to work, to errands, to everything, without ever questioning whether a second car was truly necessary. But the ledger made the math brutally clear. A second car in the 1970s meant a second loan, a second insurance premium, a second set of maintenance costs, all compounding at a time when interest rates were climbing into double digits. Linda's parents had made a deliberate choice to live with the inconvenience of shared transportation rather than take on that additional financial burden. It meant careful scheduling. It meant walking to some errands that a second car would have made instantly convenient. It meant her mother sometimes waiting an extra hour at the grocery store for her father to finish work and pick her up on the way home. Linda could see in the entries surrounding that torn note just how much money had been redirected from what would have been a second car payment into the envelope marked savings instead. It wasn't a small amount. Over a single year, it added up to more than Linda had saved in the last 3 years combined. She sat back, thinking about her own driveway, 2 cars parked side by side, and wondered for the first time whether convenience had quietly cost her family far more than she had ever bothered to calculate. Near the back of the ledger, Linda found a small yellow slip of paper stapled neatly to a page. It was a layaway receipt from a department store, dated November 1974, for a winter coat. The full price was listed at the top, along with 4 smaller payments beneath it, each one checked off by hand as it was paid. Linda stared at it for a long moment. There was no interest charge anywhere on the slip, no minimum payment warning, no fine print about penalties, just 4 honest installments, paid in cash until the coat belonged to the family outright. Layaway had been a common practice throughout the 1970s, a system where a store would hold an item aside while a customer paid it off gradually, receiving the product only once it was fully paid for. It was, in almost every sense, the opposite of the credit systems Linda used constantly in her own life, where the item arrived immediately and the payments, along with accumulating interest, came afterward. Linda thought about her own closet, filled with items she had financed through buy now, pay later apps, several of which she was, if she was honest with herself, still quietly paying off. She had never once considered that the order of operations mattered so much. Pay first, receive later meant a family never owned anything they hadn't already earned the money for. Receive first, pay later meant carrying debt forward indefinitely, often with interest working against you the entire time. The yellow slip in her hand represented a coat that had cost exactly what it said it cost, nothing more, purchased by a woman who had never once let a store's convenience dictate her family's financial terms. Linda noticed a recurring phrase scattered throughout the ledger's meal notes: Sunday roast, Monday sandwiches, Tuesday soup. She realized, flipping through page after page, that her mother had built an entire weekly meal structure around a single Sunday centerpiece, stretching it deliberately across multiple days rather than cooking something new each night. This wasn't laziness, it was strategy. A roast purchased once could become sandwiches the following day, then a hearty soup by midweek, using the bones and scraps that most households today simply discard without a second thought. Linda thought about her own refrigerator, currently home to at least 3 containers of food she fully intended to throw away by the weekend, uneaten and forgotten behind newer purchases. In the 1970s, waste wasn't just frowned upon, it was financially unthinkable for a household operating on a fixed and often shrinking budget. Every part of every ingredient had a purpose, extended as far as it could possibly go before anything was discarded. The ledger even included a small note that made Linda smile despite herself: vegetable scraps, saved for broth, not trash. Her mother had been composting flavor back into the household economy decades before Linda had ever heard the phrase meal prep used as a trendy hashtag online. Linda began to understand that the leftover economy wasn't about eating poorly or repetitively, it was about intentional design, building meals that naturally fed into one another rather than treating each dinner as an isolated event requiring its own fresh ingredients. She thought about how much money simply rotted away in her own refrigerator every single month, and for the first time, that number felt less like an accident and more like a habit she had never been taught to break. December's pages in the ledger looked entirely different from the rest of the year. Instead of grocery totals, Linda found a list titled simply "Gifts," followed by items that weren't purchases at all: knitted scarves, canned preserves wrapped in ribbon, a hand-sewn apron for Linda's aunt. The only dollar amounts listed were for yarn, fabric, and canning jars, a fraction of what store-bought gifts would have cost that same December. Linda sat with this page longer than most of the others. She thought about her own holiday spending from the previous year, the exact total of which she couldn't quite recall, only that it had felt uncomfortably high by the time January's credit card statement arrived. Her mother's approach to gift-giving during the 1970s wasn't born from a lack of love or effort. If anything, it required more time and more personal investment than simply purchasing something from a store. But it protected the family budget from what modern households now casually call holiday debt, a phrase that would have sounded absurd to a woman balancing every dollar by hand in a paper ledger. Linda noticed something else, too. Beside each handmade gift, her mother had written the recipient's name and a tiny personal note. Scarf for Barbara. She mentioned being cold at church. These weren't generic gifts assembled under pressure at the last minute. They were considered, personal, and built around actual conversations her mother had remembered and acted on. Linda realized that the handmade gift tradition wasn't simply about saving money, although it certainly did that. It was about the kind of attention that gets lost entirely when a gift can be ordered online in 30 seconds and forgotten just as quickly. Tucked into the front cover of the ledger, Linda found a small stack of handwritten grocery lists, each one folded into quarters and worn soft from being carried in a coat pocket. Every single list was organized the same way, items grouped by section of the store, nothing extra scribbled in the margins. Linda thought about her own shopping habits, wandering the aisles with a vague mental list at best, often adding items on impulse that had nothing to do with what she actually needed that week. The ledger revealed something Linda hadn't expected. Besides several of the lists, her mother had written a single number in the corner, a dollar limit for that particular trip, calculated in advance based on what remained in the grocery envelope. If the list and the limit didn't align once she reached the register, something came off the list before it ever reached the counter. There was no swiping a card for the difference. There was no overspending followed by regret in the parking lot. The math had to work before she ever walked in the door, not after. This discipline, simple as it seemed, eliminated an entire category of spending that Linda now recognized clearly in her own life. Impulse purchases made under the soft lighting and curated placement of grocery store shelves designed specifically to encourage exactly that behavior. Her mother hadn't been immune to temptation. The ledger even noted in one entry, "Wanted the good coffee," stuck with the list. But the list itself had acted as a kind of contract, signed before entering the store and honored strictly once inside. Linda realized that the humble grocery list, so often treated today as optional or forgotten entirely on the kitchen counter, had once been treated as something closer to law. One entry stopped Linda entirely. Traded eggs for Carol's tomatoes, no money exchanged. She read it twice, unsure at first what she was looking at. It wasn't a purchase, it wasn't a gift, it was a trade, negotiated casually between two neighbors, each contributing something the other needed without a single dollar changing hands. Linda flipped further and found more entries like it, scattered throughout the years. Sewing help traded for babysitting, extra canned goods traded for a neighbor's help repairing a fence, a dozen eggs, again and again, traded for whatever the household down the street happened to have too much of that week. This kind of informal bartering, common throughout many communities in the 1970s, functioned as a quiet parallel economy that never touched the family's actual cash flow. It relied entirely on relationships, on neighbors who knew each other well enough to trust that a trade today would be honored or reciprocated at some point down the line. Linda thought about her own neighborhood, where she could name perhaps 2 households on her entire street, and where the idea of trading homegrown produce for a favor felt almost like something out of a different century entirely. In many ways it was, but the financial logic behind it hadn't expired just because the practice had faded. Every trade her mother recorded in the ledger represented a need met without spending a single cent, a resource shared instead of purchased, a relationship leveraged instead of a wallet. Linda began to wonder how much of modern financial stress came not just from overspending, but from isolation, from communities that no longer shared resources the way her mother's once had, quietly, generously, and completely off the books. A short list appeared near the middle of the ledger, written almost like a set of house rules. Lights off when leaving a room, thermostat down at night, water heater lowered in summer. Linda recognized these instructions immediately, not because she had read them before, but because she remembered her mother saying almost these exact words to her as a child, usually while flipping a switch Linda had carelessly left on. At the time, it had felt like nagging. Reading it now, in the context of the entire ledger, it felt like a system. The 1970s energy crisis had driven utility costs sharply upward, and households across the country responded with exactly this kind of granular attention to consumption. Nothing ran that wasn't actively being used. Nothing stayed powered on out of habit or forgetfulness. Linda looked at the utility totals recorded beside these house rules and compared them, roughly, to her own monthly electric bill. The difference was significant, even accounting for decades of inflation and changing appliance efficiency. Her mother hadn't achieved these savings through some dramatic single decision. She had achieved them through dozens of small, repeated behaviors, enforced consistently enough that they eventually became automatic for the entire household, including a young Linda who probably rolled her eyes every single time she heard the reminder. Linda thought about her own home, where lights stayed on in empty rooms more often than she cared to admit, and where the thermostat sat at a comfortable, unchanging temperature regardless of the hour or season. None of these habits, individually, would have transformed her mother's finances. But together, tracked and enforced relentlessly across an entire year, they added up to real money, quietly redirected toward the one envelope that mattered most. Behind the ledger, wrapped in a dish towel, Linda found a mason jar filled nearly to the top with coins and a few folded dollar bills. There was no label, no note explaining its purpose, but the ledger clarified everything a few pages later. Change jar, emptied into savings account, December. Every single year, apparently, without fail. This jar wasn't part of the formal envelope system. It was something smaller, almost invisible, fed by the loose change that fell out of pockets and purses throughout the year, coins too small to feel like real money on their own. Linda realized this was a form of savings that required no discipline at all, no willpower, no difficult decision made at the register. It simply collected what would otherwise have been lost or spent thoughtlessly on something forgettable. By December, the jar in Linda's hands, still heavy with old coins, represented what the ledger recorded as nearly $40, a meaningful sum in the mid-1970s, added directly to the family's savings without ever touching the household budget itself. Linda thought about her own spare change, most of which she never even carried anymore, since nearly every transaction in her life happened digitally, invisibly, through a card or a phone. There was no jar in her home collecting anything. There was no physical reminder of small amounts of money accumulating quietly in the background. The change jar wasn't a sophisticated financial strategy. It was almost embarrassingly simple. But its simplicity was exactly why it worked so consistently, year after year, without ever requiring her mother to think about it twice. Linda set the jar on the counter, coins clinking softly, and made a small mental note to find one of her own. One entry made Linda pause and reread it twice. Day-old bread, half price, tastes the same by Tuesday. It was such a small, almost forgettable note, buried among the larger entries, but it captured something Linda hadn't fully considered. Buying slightly imperfect, marked down, or day-old goods wasn't treated as embarrassing in her mother's household. It was treated as smart, even something close to a small private victory recorded proudly in ink. Linda thought about her own shopping habits, always reaching instinctively for the freshest loaf on the shelf, the newest carton, the item furthest from the sell-by date, often without even glancing at the discounted section tucked away near the back of the store. There was, if she was honest with herself, a quiet social pressure behind that instinct, an unspoken sense that buying discounted or day-old items signaled something uncomfortable about a family's finances. But the ledger told a different story entirely. Her mother hadn't hidden these purchases. She had documented them openly, sometimes even noting the exact savings beside the entry, as though proud of the math rather than ashamed of the discount. Generic brands appeared throughout the ledger in exactly the same way, unmarked by any hesitation or apology, simply chosen deliberately because the difference in quality rarely justified the difference in price. Linda began to understand that this entire generation of women had approached frugality not as a source of shame, but as a demonstration of competence, proof that a household could stretch every dollar without sacrificing what actually mattered. The pride wasn't in what was bought, it was in what was saved. And Linda realized she had spent years avoiding exactly the kind of smart, small decisions her mother had once made without a second thought. Near the final third of the ledger, Linda found a section unlike anything before it, headed simply Family Talk. Beneath it, dated roughly once a month, were short summaries of conversations that had clearly happened around this very kitchen table, involving Linda's father and, as the children grew older, Linda herself and her siblings. Discussed vacation fund, agreed to wait until next year. Explained the envelope system to the kids tonight. Linda sat back, stunned, trying to remember any of these conversations from her own childhood, and finding only faint, half-formed memories of sitting at this table while her parents talked about money in a way that felt, at the time, completely ordinary. She realized now how extraordinary it actually was. Many households, then and now, treat financial conversations as private, even secretive, something discussed behind closed doors and never in front of children. Linda's parents had done the opposite, deliberately including their children in monthly discussions about the family's financial reality, its goals, and its limits. This wasn't about burdening children with adult stress. The entries were calm, practical, almost businesslike in tone. It was about transparency, and more importantly, about education, teaching an entire next generation how a household budget actually worked long before any of them would need to manage one themselves. Linda thought about her own children, teenagers now, who had never once sat through a conversation about the family's finances, who had no real understanding of what things cost or how decisions about money actually got made. She wondered, uncomfortably, whether she had accidentally raised a generation as financially unprepared as she sometimes felt herself, simply by keeping conversations her own parents had once made routine, silent instead. Near the very back of the ledger, tucked between two ordinary entries, Linda found a page that looked different from all the others. The handwriting was shakier, written later in life, long after the 1970s had ended. It was dated nearly 20 years after the rest of the ledger, and it read simply, "Still using the envelopes. Still works." Linda sat completely still, reading those 6 words over and over. Her mother hadn't abandoned this system once the stagflation crisis passed, once wages caught up, once the economy stabilized and modern conveniences like credit cards and eventually digital banking became widely available. She had kept going, decades later, because the system itself had never actually been about surviving one specific economic crisis. It had been a permanent philosophy, built once out of necessity and maintained afterward out of genuine conviction. Linda realized this was the detail she had almost overlooked entirely, tucked quietly at the back of a ledger she had nearly dismissed as an interesting artifact from a difficult decade. This wasn't a temporary emergency strategy that a family abandoned the moment things got easier. It was a lifelong practice, chosen deliberately and sustained voluntarily, long after it had stopped being strictly necessary. Linda thought about her own financial habits, built almost entirely around convenience, speed, and automation, systems designed to require as little of her attention as possible. Her mother's system had demanded the opposite: constant attention, weekly reconciliation, ongoing discipline. And yet she had chosen to keep it for the rest of her life, even when easier options became available. Linda finally understood that this wasn't a story about the 1970s at all. It was a story about a woman who had found something that worked and simply refused to let convenience talk her out of it. On the very final page of the ledger, Linda found something she hadn't expected. It wasn't a budget entry, it wasn't a grocery list. It was a short, handwritten note addressed directly to her. For Linda, when she's ready to understand why we did all of this. Linda's hands trembled slightly as she read the rest. Her mother explained in plain and simple language that none of these 20 habits had ever really been about money in isolation. The envelopes, the ledger, the garden, the mended clothes, the family meetings around this very table, all of it had been in service of a single, larger goal that Linda had never fully articulated until this exact moment: security. Not wealth for its own sake, not the appearance of success, but the quiet, unshakable confidence that came from knowing exactly where every dollar was, exactly what the family could and couldn't afford, and exactly how to weather whatever economic storm arrived next, because one always eventually did. Her mother had built that security by hand, one habit at a time, over years of discipline that never once required a single loan, a single interest payment, or a single moment of financial guesswork. Linda closed the ledger slowly and looked around her own kitchen, at the bills stacked unopened on the counter, at the phone buzzing with another automated spending notification she would probably ignore. She understood now that the 20th habit, the one that tied every other habit together, wasn't a specific technique at all. It was the decision to pay attention, consistently, deliberately, and without apology, to something most modern households had quietly outsourced to apps and algorithms. Linda picked up a pen. It was time to start her own ledger.